This is AP News Minute. Donald Trump vowed to sue every woman who has accused him of sexual assault or other inappropriate behavior. He made the comments at a rally in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, calling the women liars. Hillary Clinton's running mate Tim Kaine is sounding a hopeful note that a Democratic White House could work with Republicans to bridge deep divides made apparent this election cycle. Iraqi and Kurdish Peshmerga forces battled Islamic State militants to retake areas surrounding Mosul in Iraq. On Saturday, plumes of smoke clouded the setting sun over a town just east of Mosul. Migrants and refugees clashed with French police in a Calais camp on Saturday. French police used tear gas to disperse the migrants and refugees who threw stones in their direction. Tensions have been rising ahead of the camp's closure next week. Noreen Nasser, Associated Press, with AP News Minute.
The battle to retake Mosul broadens as the Islamic State group launches a spate of attacks to the east of the city. Explosions have rocked Kirkuk, an oil city under Kurdish control. A government compound and a power station were among several buildings targeted in an assault that began in the middle of the night. Islamic State group militants have taken their fight east in an apparent effort to divert the thousands of troops closing in on their stronghold. A major assault to the northeast of Mosul is still underway. The strategically important town of Bashika has been pounded by airstrikes from Peshmerga positions. The operation is being supported by the international coalition, including around 5,000 US troops.
Anytime that we engage in airstrikes in an urban area, it is very problematic. There are obviously lots of areas for the enemy to conceal themselves. There are areas where they can blend in the civilian population.
It's the fifth day of the battle to liberate Mosul. Baghdad says Kurdish Peshmerga and Iraqi forces have advanced faster than expected. In a setback, a member of the US military was killed by a roadside bomb on Thursday, marking the first American casualty in the campaign.
We begin in the northern Iraqi city of Kirkuk, where for a second day security forces have been battling dozens of militants from the Islamic State group who infiltrated that city and launched their attack at precisely the moment attentions were focused 170 kilometers away on the city of Mosul. Well, officials in Kirkuk say that at least 80 people, most of them Iraqi soldiers, have been killed during these past 2 days of violence. 48 jihadist attackers are also reported to have been killed and several others injured. The Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, meanwhile, says that reinforcements are being sent to Kirkuk. France 24's Adam Pletz was in the area earlier on today. He brings us the latest.
Earlier today, a city that's still reeling from Friday's, that is, attack by Islamic State group in what seems like an attempt to distract from the offensive on Mosul, but also to hit Kurdish forces in what they hoped would be a softer target. And this is a complex attack which hit several locations. 48 members of the Islamic State group were killed and some 10 members of the Kurdish security forces. Now, we met with the second highest ranking member of the Peshmerga in the Kirkuk area, who showed us around one of the locations that had been hit. That's a Kurdish security forces base, and it was still very fresh from the fight. Quite disturbing sights. They had actually placed the body of one of the Islamic State group fighters who blew himself up with a suicide vest. They had placed that in a bin, and you could still hear fighting in the distance some 5 kilometers away from us, which we were told were isolated members of Islamic State group cells that they had pinned down and were now pursuing. So there were still after effects from yesterday's attack, and certainly you could hear that fighting continuing in the distance. But the Peshmerga felt that they dealt with the Islamic State group's offensive on that city, smuggling fighters into Kirkuk. But they didn't rule out, of course, the possibility that this could happen again in Kirkuk or other locations which Islamic State group may try to target in Kurdistan to distract from Mosul, where they're obviously losing ground against both the Peshmerga and Iraqi security forces.
That was France 24's Adam Pletz reporting from Erbil in northern Iraq.
Well, now we're joined by Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol. Hello, Mr. Gosling. Thanks for joining us on Press TV's Top 5 once again, sir. Now, Mr. Gosling, your views on how the UK can arm and train the Saudis to kill innocent Yemeni civilians, and the UN hasn't issued any resolution to put a stop to it, and the ICC hasn't mentioned complicity in war crimes not one time.
Well, I'm afraid not. And it's also interesting, we just heard this week about South Africa and other African countries leaving the International Criminal Court. They've decided that it's a kangaroo court. They've had enough of it, and I'm afraid it's in meltdown. That's because it's controlled by the West. But look, on Wednesday this week at Prime Minister's Questions, the leader of the Scottish National Party also approached Theresa May, questioned Theresa May in public, our Prime Minister, saying what is going on with supplying these weapons to Saudi Arabia that are being used to kill, and the UN, not me, the UN are saying roughly 5,000 civilians have now been killed, and 2/3 of all of those killed in Yemen have been civilians since this, well, you can't call it a war, it's a slaughter that started. Let's also not forget that you've got President Hadi there, who is actually aligning himself with the Saudis. This is unbelievable, isn't it, that the president of a country could be aligning himself with a foreign power that is killing 2/3 of his own civilians, of everybody that's killed. So this president is obviously not fit to take office, and it doesn't surprise anyone to hear that he was installed in Yemen, which is the poorest country in the Middle East, by the West. So that's why this civil war is happening, is because of interference from outside in what's been happening in Yemen. Yeah, so what I'm saying is the Liberal Democrats who have condemned this today and called for an end to arms shipments aren't the first. There are many other parties in Britain, the opposition parties, who are basically calling out this Theresa May government for backing what is essentially a money-making exercise, £3.3 billion a year being made by British companies by selling arms to the Saudi Arabians. And now we hear as well supporting the training of the pilots that are doing the killing, what many believe are war crimes.
And Mr. Gosling, now, if a non-Western country or a non-Western allied country would go down the same exact path, like the UK, train and arm one of its allies to carry out bombing in a neighboring country on funerals, shelters, on weddings, and kill an indiscriminate number of disproportionate, number of civilians, what would that country's fate be?
Well, I think, that it's pretty obvious that it's a propaganda war being fought here, because it's complete double standards for the crimes of the British, by the British and the Americans and the Israelis. Look, 2 weeks ago, you mentioned the attack on the funeral. In Sana'a, we had a 500-pound laser-guided US bomb, killed 150 people roughly, and wounded about 600 people. The investigation last weekend said that there was an unnamed party behind that. And what we're hearing now, of course, is that a lot of training and logistical support for the Saudis has been being provided by the British. I wonder if it was the British who are the unnamed party. They claimed that the site contained Houthi rebel leaders. Well, maybe it did, one or two that attended the funeral, but there's no need to kill 150 people and wound 600. So you've seen a ramping up over the last months by the British, really, in their intervention. They admit that Britain has been helping to target Saudi attacks, and they say, the Ministry of Defence, that they're ensuring the rules of war are complied with. They said that in January 2016 this year. And that since then, the attacks on civilians have actually increased because most of the military targets have been destroyed. So what is behind the Saudi slaughter in Yemen? Many people around the world, except maybe the British government and the British people who are not, this is not being reported properly here in Britain, are asking what's behind it. What's happening is that the Middle East is being balkanised and destabilised, and this is happening to every country, every sovereign country that does not follow US and Israeli orders. Massive war crimes, I think, covering hundreds of thousands of square miles across the Middle East, aided and abetted by hundreds of millions of dollars of Pentagon propaganda, as we found out last week. Companies like Bell Pottinger paid to actually fake news reports, which are then inserted into the Western television reports. So that's effectively what's going on. And a war crime is absolutely what is these kind of civilian targeted killings. We've also seen a US Navy destroyer firing cruise missiles. No real reporting of that, no decision for the US to get involved. And it's also worth mentioning the very last Nuremberg prosecutor from after the Second World War is one still alive who was prosecuting the Nazis at the end of World War II, Benjamin Ferencz. He has 3 words for the people involved in these war crimes: law, not war, because the rule of law is being torn up by the West in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and right across the Middle East for the convenience of Israel and Israeli expansionism.
Thank you. We should also add the bombings aren't just a war crime in Yemen. The prevention of when you deny a civilian population food, medicine, and water, that's also a war crime that Saudis are doing with the blockade there. Thank you much once again, Mr. Tony Gosling, for your valuable input out of Bristol Investigative.
Deputies say a homeowner shot and killed a masked man who broke into his house early this morning in Goldsboro. It happened on Little River Drive around 4:15 this morning. Deputies say the homeowner and his family were asleep when their alarm was activated. They say the suspect held a gun on the homeowner before the two got into some kind of struggle. Later, the suspect was shot with his own gun. That man was taken to the hospital where he later died. He has not been identified. Neighbors tell CBS North Carolina this should be a wake-up call, saying if anyone else comes, they'll get the same results. Deputies say charges are not expected against the homeowner.